Well, hi again. Today is March 12th. It's the 9th week of the legislative session. And today I'm going to focus on talking with you about the budget. And so this is the graph that portrays the governor's proposed budget for this coming year. This is the budget that the legislature is discussing and evaluating right now. So the very first bar, on the first orange bar that you see here on the graph, is education. I hear a lot from people saying we need to spend more on education. It's actually the item we spend the most amount on. It's about $1.3 billion this year. So we're looking at the possibility of early passing that budget, early funding education, so that's under discussion. And then, of course, you have to add the university's budget to it. Now, this is the university's budget here. It's about $300 million, but if you add that on to the education budget, it actually adds up to about $1.5 billion, K through 12 and university level appropriation. Another interesting bar on this graph, I'm going to get back to the second one in just a moment, is this one right here, and that's the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections proposed budget is about $300 million. But the second big bar on this graph is health. The health budget appropriation that's being asked for this year is about $1.1, almost $1.2 billion. Now, you have to add to that the $100 million supplemental that the Department of Health is asking for to cover the rest of this year from March to the end of June. The additional expenses are predominantly due to the Medicaid expansion. So overall, nationwide, Medicaid spending has tripled in the last 20 years. In fact, if it continues on the same trajectory it's on right now, it's anticipated in the next 5 years, the Department of Health and Medicaid spending will exceed the budget for the Department of Defense. In Alaska, we offer all the optional services that are potential under Medicaid. Most other states do not offer all of them, but Alaska has the most generous Medicaid system in the United States. And then add to that, Governor Walker expanded the system to include working age, non-disabled men. So that has resulted in a pretty significant increase in our budget. One of the lines I want to really focus on as well, spend some time on, is this blue line right here. This is the spending for the permanent fund dividend. Now, you see how tall this bar is. In fact, it exceeds the bar for education. This would be the amount appropriated if the formula for the permanent fund dividend were followed completely this year. So it would be up here around, let's see, what does that say? $1.7 billion. Now, the legislature is looking at a dividend of about the full expenditure would be about $1.2 billion. This is what the governor is proposing. Actually, the legislature, the Senate side is proposing one slightly smaller than that. But you can see if the bar were only this high, it would be significantly less expenditure. There's a lot of discussion around the permanent fund dividend, and many folks are proposing that we actually put the permanent fund formula, this tall bar, into the Constitution. In other words, mandate this spending every year. So that's something that we really need to think about. You know, in 1976, Governor Hammond had an article in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner. This was the year that citizens were going to vote on putting the permanent fund itself, the fund itself, into the Constitution. Now, the legislature had passed a plan to do that, and Governor Hammond had vetoed it. And the reason was he wanted a constitutional amendment, and he wanted this is what his op-ed said, quote, The income from the permanent fund would be available for general appropriation by the legislature. End quote. So this was an op-ed. You can probably still find it online, November 2nd, 1976, in the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner. He went on to say in his op-ed that he feared, quote, the bureaucracy beast would have to feed off income, property, corporate, or sales tax, stripped from the pockets of those of us still here, end quote, when the oil revenue stopped flowing. Now, in November of 1976, the citizens of Alaska voted by 66% to put the permanent fund into our Constitution. And so the permanent fund itself, the corpus, that means the body, can be found in Article 9, Section 15. It says, at least 25% of all mineral lease rentals, royalties, royalty sale proceeds, federal mineral royalty sharing payments, and bonuses received by the state shall be placed in the permanent fund, the principal of which shall be used only for those income-producing investments specifically designated by law as eligible for permanent fund investments. All income from the permanent fund shall be deposited in the general fund unless otherwise provided by law. The general fund is the fund from which the legislature appropriates money to fund government. Road, snow removal, education, corrections, state troopers, etc. So in 1980, the Permanent Fund Corporation was founded. In 1982, the first dividend came out, and it was totally based on the revenue we got from oil. There was no earnings at that time. We didn't actually have the earnings reserve account until about 6 years later when that was formed. Now, in 1986, many of you were here, because I hear from many of you. My family and I were here. My husband and I had 3 small children at the time, and that was the time when our economy really contracted. Not only did oil prices fall, but the housing boom collapsed at that time as well. And so it was a huge recession. It was the time when you hear about people throwing the keys in the door, closing the door behind them, throwing the keys behind them, and walking away from their mortgages and their homes here. My husband and I held on during that time with 3 small children. He didn't have a job at that time. We had several months of no income, and it was a while before another job emerged for him. But we hung in there, and during that time, we did what families do. We cut back our spending. We didn't stop saving, however. We continued to save our children's permanent fund dividends. And 10 years after that recession, our first child went to college, and the other 2 subsequently as well, on the earnings on that permanent fund dividend that they had saved, that we had saved for them over all that time. You know, the word economy means home management. And I know what it's like to manage a home during times of tight budgets. And that's the approach I'm taking now as our state government is having some constricted budgeting, some constricted revenues. So that's how I'm looking at all of this. The Senate's intention is to maintain Hammond's intent for the permanent fund. That is, preserve that corpus, preserve the earnings reserve account and the dividend, but use a small portion of that earnings reserve account, the ERA, in a percent of market value, that is, a percent of the earnings that it generates, to fund government. Now, later on in this newsletter, you're going to see a video by my colleague, Senator Natasha von Imhoff. She explains a bit more about what percent of market value is, and I hope you enjoy that video. She's going to emphasize the point that use of the earnings reserve must be done in a structured way. Last year, the House attempted to do this in an unstructured way, that is simply randomly taking money out of the earnings reserve account. They wanted to take $5 billion out of it. The Senate is not in favor of doing that. That will decimate that earnings reserve account and cause the permanent fund dividend to go away completely. and that is not our intent. The percent of market value is something we need to do to ride out this time when our revenues are very low. But that's not all. There is a second piece that we need to do, and that's something called an appropriation limit. In other words, a limit on the amount of money that can be spent. That's in Senate Joint Resolution 2. The appropriation limit that we're looking at is $4.3 billion. So that would be the spending cap. Of course, there are exceptions, for example, for dispersing the permanent fund dividend, bond repayments, disaster relief fund, that kind of thing. But we need to constrain our spending as well. So I know this is complicated and probably not terribly interesting, but at the same time, it's critical for our state's future. So thanks for listening this week, and I look forward to seeing you next week.